Welcome to the discussion on app development on iOS. iOS, one of the most popular mobile operating systems and the platform on which iPhones and iPads and iPod Touch run. So, any app that is developed on iOS will run on all these devices, but the catch is that one cannot develop the app for iOS on iOS platform. Further, they need to have a Mac which runs OS X, and after installing and downloading the Xcode, then app development for iOS devices is possible. In today's discussion, we will be taking an example and we will be going through different steps from a logic perspective that needs to be taken to develop a full-fledged app on iOS devices. The steps that we will be going through is for a food ordering app. We know there are several apps that can be used for placing order for food. For example, in India, we have apps like Zomato and Swiggy, and in every country there are large number of apps using which we can place order. Now, let us consider some app of this sort and let us see what are the steps we have to take in case we have to develop an app for iOS devices. It means that it will be available on the app store of iPad, iPhone to download, install and run and place order for food using that particular app. So, the most important step before starting developing an app for iOS devices is to download and install the Xcode app from App Store on the Mac. And while we are looking for Xcode on the App Store, and once we located and once we show our intention to download it, it will be prompting for our Apple ID and password. Once we enter them correctly, the download starts and it is available for the run. Initially, to develop any app, we need to work on the user interface. User interface is very important because this is how it looks for the user. Starting from a small child to an experienced adult, the user interface plays a major role in retaining the customer. So, we need to build a basic user interface, then connect that user interface to the code. We should work with the view controllers, we should implement a custom control, and finally, we need to define our data model. Now, each of these steps will be gone through in detail, so that we are through with the development of an app for iOS devices from the perspective of logic. Now, as of syntax and semantics are concerned, again they are completely a different ball game, because one needs to know the Swift programming language, only then they will be able to develop the app for iOS using Xcode and Mac. So, let us see how to build a basic user interface. First, create a code in the Xcode. So, after creating the project in Xcode, identify the purpose of the key files that are created with an Xcode project template. Open and switch between various files in the project, then run an app in the iOS simulator. So, once we are able to run an app in the iOS simulator, we are through with building the elementary app for the iOS devices. Then we have to extend it with different features for the food ordering app. Then we can add, move and resize user interface elements in a storyboard. So, in the storyboard you have different elements. We can decide to add more elements, we can decide to change the existing element set, or we can even decide to change the size of each user interface object, and ultimately whatever we confirm, the code for the same will be in place. So, we can add, we can move and we can resize the user interface elements in the storyboard. After that, we have to edit the attributes of the user interface elements in the storyboard using the attributes inspector. View and rearrange the user interface elements using the outline view, because the final outline view is very important, because that is how it looks to the customers. Preview a storyboard user interface using the assistant editor's preview mode. So, we have to use the auto layout to lay out a user interface that automatically adapts to the user's device size. The next step is connecting the user interface to the code. Visualize the relationship between a scene in a storyboard and the underlying view controller. So, once we have the view controller, we need to think about the entire scene analysis, like how that particular user interface element will be used by the customer. If the customer uses that particular user interface element, then what are the actions that needs to be triggered? If those actions are to be implemented, then what is the corresponding code that needs to be invoked? All these things are to be thought of. So, first create an outlet and action connections between the user interface elements in a storyboard and source code. Then process user input from a text field and display the result in the user interface. So, whenever user is entering a particular food item or user is entering the address where the food needs to be delivered, all these things, that particular data that is entered needs to be shown on the app for confirmation to the customer. Then we have to make a class that is conforming to protocol. We have to understand the delegation pattern, then we have to follow the target action pattern when designing the app architecture. See, the app architecture plays a major role because the app architecture will be using the native elements of that particular platform. When we are targeting the iOS app, we are using the Swift, we are using Xcode, and whatever power is there to the iOS devices, all those power is available through the latest version features of the iOS, and we need to use those features to develop the app that will utilize these features and to function to the extreme levels. Then we have to work with the view controllers. We have to understand the view controller life cycle and its callbacks. Without understanding the view controller life cycle, it will be very difficult for us to use different view controls, because every view controller is having its life cycle and the callback mechanism is very much important to switch from one view controller to another view controller. Then we have to pass data between view controllers, then we have to dismiss a view controller once we decide not to use that view controller further. We should also use gesture recognizers to generate events, because nowadays we can just wave our hand and try to do some actions. So, gestures are very important and we have to now develop code for each gesture which we think that the app should follow. So, if you have to gesture compliance, we have to use gesture recognizers to generate events. We have to anticipate object behavior based on the UI view and UI control class hierarchy. So, appropriate classes and appropriate controllers are to be used, and we have to use the asset catalog to add image assets to a project. Then we have to implement a custom controller. So, to implement a custom control, we have to create and associate the custom source code files with elements in a storyboard. Then we have to define the custom class, and again once we define the custom class, we have to include all those actions, we have to include all those data which we think needs to be in place to make our app function appropriately and in the way we want. Then we have to implement an initiator on the custom class. We have to use UI stack view as a container. Then we have to create views pragmatically. We have to add accessibility information to a custom controller. We have to work with IB inspectable and IB designable to display and control a custom view in interface builder. So, we have to remember to use both IB inspectable and IB designable to display and control a custom view in the interface builder. Once we follow all these steps, we will be in a position to implement a custom control effectively. And finally, we have to define the data model, because data model is very important, because every app will be working on the data. Very few apps will be there which will be working with very minimal data, but otherwise, for example, if you take a food ordering app, it will be trying to get the restaurant information, it will be trying to get the menus in different restaurants, it will be trying to get the cost information, then different categories of charges that are needed, then a GPS mechanism, then the time it takes to deliver, then the payment. So, you have a lot of data. So, ultimately we have to define the data model also. Without data model, the app development will be incomplete. So, as part of the data model, first of all we have to create a data model, and once we create a data model, we have to write failable initializers for a custom class. Once we write the failable initializers for the custom class, we have to test our data model. Once the data model testing is successful, then we can think of deploying on a beta basis before releasing the app for iOS in a full-fledged manner to the market. So, these are the different technical steps that needs to be taken, but one important thing to remember is that iOS app development is only possible on the Macs and on the OS X environment, and one needs to download and install the Xcode, and we should also know Swift to some extent, and if we know Swift perfectly, then we will be able to use all the latest features of the iOS. Otherwise, we will be able to use most of the features, but not maybe the latest features in case we do not know the Swift programming language. So, once all these things are done, the app will be ready, and once app is ready, after following the due procedures set by Apple, we can upload it to the App Store, and the app will be available for download and install by different customers. So, these are different steps in the development of mobile app for the iOS devices. So, thank you very much.